And now we are in the vaccine. I hand over to Dr. Melanie Saville, the scientific director of CEPI, who, contrary to some people who may prone that the world did not prepare itself for a pandemic, well, CEPI is the proof that already years ago, visionary people have foreseen that we should be prepared. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joris, and I'm very pleased to be here and to present on vaccine development for COVID-19. So if we move to the first slide, I will actually start indeed with a little bit about CEPI, and as you said, I'm already looking at preparing for the situation of a new pandemic. So CEPI is actually an organization that was set up in 2017 in the wake of the Ebola crisis in West Africa to accelerate vaccine development against emerging infectious diseases and ensure that the vaccines developed were accessible to the populations who need them most. So in the next slide. So in that sense, an organization like CEPI is set up around 3 strategic objectives. Firstly, preparedness, and in this context, CEPI was funding development for vaccines against emerging infectious diseases in the WHO R&D blueprint list. And I'll talk a little bit about MERS, which is very relevant specifically to the COVID-19 outbreak. In addition to that, a clear objective is looking to better respond by accelerating vaccine development as new emerging infectious diseases arise. And in that context, looking at the use of rapid response platforms for development. And then the third piece, which is always important, is that outbreaks are very unpredictable. So to ensure that there is a sustainable model that can allow access to vaccines that are needed for emerging infectious diseases. So next slide. So this just shows you what we're aiming to do in terms of the sustainable partnership. It's really about working as a coalition, both as a funder, but also as a facilitator across the whole vaccine development and implementation chain. Next slide. So here you'll see in the pre-COVID situation, what CEPI was looking at in terms of vaccines. And you see there we have the 5 priority pathogens, one of which was MERS, and MERS was not chosen as a pathogen for developing vaccines solely for MERS as a disease, but because of coronaviruses in general being able to cause outbreaks. Obviously, we had SARS, then we have MERS, and actually not unexpectedly, we now have SARS-CoV-2. And I think it's fair to say by developing vaccines for MERS, we've learned a lot that has been inputted into the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. In addition to that, looking at investing into what we used to call Disease X, which is preparing for that next epidemic or indeed pandemic, by looking at rapid response platforms that could rapidly get into clinical testing from identification of the sequence. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at vaccine development, there's obviously the vaccine candidates that are particularly important, but there are a lot of enabling sciences that we should not forget at the same time that are always accompanying the vaccine development, the need for antibody standards, for assays to evaluate the vaccines, antigens, animal models in particular, to try and predict the best vaccine candidates to offer protection, diagnostics, and clearly following epidemiology to inform on clinical trials and where they can be done. So it's important when we're thinking of vaccine development that all of these enabling sciences are also being developed at the same time. Next slide. So just a few words about rapid response platforms. So CEPI put out a call for proposals to accelerate vaccine development through these more new and novel technologies. with some aspirational goals of getting from sequence to the clinic within 16 weeks, and having vaccines that were scalable and offered rapid clinical development. So the idea is to test this against multiple pathogens, and through development of platforms and generation of platform data, this can offer some acceleration. And as part of this, we had a live fire exercise that was in the contract, so that if a disease X came along, we could rapidly move or divert the researchers to developing a vaccine and testing these vaccines against the timelines for the new pathogen. And so we were working on RNA, but also some rapid recombinant protein approaches that we actually applied to COVID-19. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So moving on specifically to COVID-19. Oh, the previous slide. Sorry, there must have been a lag. Thank you. Moving on to development of COVID-19 vaccines, I think there are three key words in terms of looking at what are the attributes of the vaccines that we are looking for, and they are around speed, scale, and access. Obviously, it's important to move forward rapidly and get data as quickly as possible in terms of the proof of concept of a vaccine. As we're in a pandemic in this situation, vaccines that have the ability to scale to hundreds of millions of doses is something that is absolutely critical in this circumstance, as pretty much the whole global population potentially needs a vaccine. And then access, because this is a global pandemic, ensuring that no matter where people are around the globe, that they have access to the vaccine. And so there are some key points to pay attention to in development of vaccines. So how can we use those rapid response platforms? How should we use the more proven vaccine development technologies that are readily scaled? You may not get the clinical data quite as early as the rapid response platforms, which are still really in development phase. However, these will catch up in the context of being able to rapidly scale to large-scale manufacturing. A few words on the importance of adjuvants, especially for dose sparing, when we know that doses will be in short supply. A few more mentions on some of the advancements in the enabling sciences, and really looking at the global manufacturing capacity. Next slide. So on this next slide, it's informative to see that really we're only a few months into actually knowing about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and COVID-19, but there has been enormous progress being made over time. And at the top there, you'll see that I think everyone has realized that this is, as a global problem, there is the launch of the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, which is looking across vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics to make sure that using all of the global resources available and all of the science that we can move forward development as rapidly as possible. And you can see at the bottom some key points for CEPI, but I have to say that CEPI as an organization looks very carefully at the vaccine landscape. And as of today, we've actually identified that there are over 200 vaccines in development. At least people are saying that they are working on vaccine candidates. And we have at least 10 that have already got into at least phase 1 clinical trials. If we move to the next slide. So this shows you the COVID-19 vaccine candidates that are funded by CEPI. You will see that there are a variety of platform technologies. And as pointed out by the previous speaker, there are a number of different approaches. So far with what CEPI has, we're looking at nucleic acid approaches. recombinant protein approaches and viral vectors. There are obviously inactivated vaccines and also live attenuated vaccines that also need to be considered. You can see that all of these vaccines are based around the spike antigen. So moving back to MERS, indeed, all of the MERS vaccines that were being developed were also being developed against spike, and we're showing good protection data in animal models with the spike protein. The majority here are with the full-length spike, but one of the candidates is with the receptor binding domain, and you can see with a variety of companies. Importantly, companies have made their adjuvants available for testing. So AS03, the Dynavax, CPG, and MF59 are being tested with some of these candidates. And also to inform you that we do have a second call for proposal for vaccine candidates that need funding based on our principles of speed, scale, and access. Next slide. So this slide is really trying to show you what we are all trying to do with the pandemic of COVID-19. You see at the top the traditional paradigm for development, which takes years, if not decades, to develop a vaccine. And what we're trying to do in the outbreak situation is move from those decades to a 12 to 18 month time frame, which means a lot of investment up front in scaling up and scaling out manufacturing, often even before you have clinical proof of concept. We should always remember the importance of safety and efficacy testing in human clinical trials, and there is no shortcut for that. You can use adaptive designs to ensure you have an expedited clinical development plan. But clearly, this is what we are all aiming for in terms of vaccine development. Next slide. I wanted to highlight the importance of the regulators in the development of COVID-19 vaccines. Obviously, each individual manufacturer needs to have their interactions with their regulators on their own particular specific candidates, but there are many points that can be discussed with regulators to look at expedited regulatory review and pathways to licensure. And we are pleased at CEPI to be engaged with regulators at a global level, including, for example, working very closely with ABRF for the African countries. Next slide, please. The clinical development plan is obviously critical, as I pointed out, and always first in human trials need to be done in healthy adult volunteers, but quite rapidly the view is to move to efficacy trials and looking at adaptive designs. Of particular note, WHO has developed a master protocol that can allow multiple candidates to flow in and out of an efficacy trial. And the other important factor is safety. Many of you will be aware with some previous coronaviruses that vaccine-mediated enhanced disease was observed in some animal models. So it has been important to carefully evaluate the data, define some good animal models and immunological assays to assess the potential risk of enhanced disease. And in this context, careful evaluation in clinical trials of that safety is needed. Next slide. A few words on the manufacturing. I mentioned the importance of really bringing forward the development of the scale up and scale out of the manufacturing process, even before and in parallel with very early development before clinical proof of concept has been reached in order to meet the aspirational timelines. CEPI as an organization has put out an expression of interest to really understand the global capacity that is out there for manufacturing, both of drug substance and drug product. As clearly at this point in time, we are looking to produce hundreds of millions, if not billions of doses over a very short period of time. Next slide. A few words on some of the enabling sciences. assays and standards. So assays and standards are being developed, and IBSC is developing an antibody standard that can be used in all immunological assays. CEPI and others are developing some centralized laboratory capabilities. The huge scientific community have been looking at animal models. In terms of developing these animal models, there are some promising models from non-human primates, in particular macaques, hamsters, and ferrets as good animal models. And it's clearly important to make sure that there is accessibility to the laboratories for testing the vaccine candidates. Next slide. With any vaccine development, it's important to follow the epidemiology, to model for disease and model for potential vaccination strategy, but also very clearly to help with the clinical development plan. We've seen the first wave of COVID-19, but how do we evaluate efficacy? So it's really important to make sure that we have validated case definitions through the epidemiology that we can ascertain and determine where the best places are to conduct clinical trials. Next slide. So I mentioned the ACT accelerator. So CEPI, together with Gavi, working very closely with WHO, are really hoping to bring together the vaccine community and to accelerate vaccine development, and also to raise the funds that are needed to support the best candidates that are built around the speed, scale, and access. Next slide. And then just to comment, I think it's very important that information on vaccine development and challenges associated with vaccine development are available to developers. So CEPI has a new open access hub, which is part of the Global Health Network, and you can see the link here. So this can provide you with some information on important meetings and data as it's becoming available. Next slide. So overall, in summary, I think it's important that we have a strong and diverse vaccine candidate portfolio. Under the ACT Accelerator, we do have an open call for proposal for additional candidates, so we welcome candidates to apply. We are developing enabling sciences, animal models, and assays and standards in order to evaluate the vaccines, developing a global footprint of manufacturers to ensure that we can get to a place where hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine can be manufactured and allocated in a fair allocation system. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Melanie.